Marie Antoinette remains one of the most controversial and misunderstood figures in European history. To some, she was a frivolous queen who wasted the wealth of France on extravagant parties and luxurious gowns while her people starved. To others, she was a tragic scapegoat, a young woman trapped in the machinery of politics and blamed for the collapse of a kingdom. Yet beneath these familiar stories lies a far more human truth. Marie Antoinette suffered deeply not only from the hostility of her people, but also from a series of hidden mental struggles that modern historians and psychologists are only beginning to uncover. Her emotional instability, paranoia, and symptoms resembling severe depression were not simply products of her character. They were the result of years of psychological pressure, isolation, and trauma. Born an Austrian archduchess in 1755, Marie Antoinette was thrust into a world of impossible expectations. From a very early age, she was raised not as an individual, but as a political instrument of the Habsburg dynasty. Her marriage to Louis, the future king of France, was not one of love, but of strategy. At just 14 years old, she left her homeland behind, stripped of everything Austrian, including her clothes, attendants, and even her childhood mementos, to begin a new life in the strict and judgmental environment of the French court at Versailles. For a young girl, this separation was deeply traumatic. Modern psychology tells us that such abrupt dislocation from family and culture can lead to long-lasting anxiety disorders, and in Antoinette's case, it likely marked the beginning of her emotional fragility. At Versailles, she faced relentless scrutiny. Every gesture, every word, every outfit was examined and judged by courtiers who were eager to gossip and undermine her. Her inability to produce an heir for the first several years of her marriage became an obsession for both the French public and the royal family. This failure, though largely the result of Louis's physical difficulties, was placed entirely on her shoulders. Contemporary accounts suggest that Marie Antoinette began showing signs of paranoia and social withdrawal during these years. She developed what today might be recognized as symptoms of social anxiety disorder, fear of being constantly watched, judged, and ridiculed. These psychological burdens were magnified by the unique cruelty of court life. Versailles was not a home, but a theater where appearances mattered more than reality. The queen was never alone. Even the most intimate moments, such as dressing and bathing, were public rituals. Privacy did not exist. This constant surveillance would have been mentally exhausting and deeply destabilizing. Psychologists now argue that prolonged exposure to such conditions can contribute to the development of depressive episodes and even psychotic features, as the mind struggles to cope with the loss of personal boundaries. By her early 20s, Marie Antoinette began to display patterns of behavior that modern observers might describe as escapist coping mechanisms. She indulged in lavish spending, elaborate entertainments, and the construction of her private retreat, the Petit Trianon, where she could temporarily escape the suffocating environment of Versailles. Critics of her time condemned this as vanity and decadence, but from a psychological perspective, it was likely a form of self-preservation. Creating a space of refuge was her way of maintaining a fragile sense of control in a life where she otherwise had none. Her extravagant lifestyle can therefore be understood less as evidence of selfishness and more as a symptom of underlying emotional distress. The most striking aspect of her hidden struggles, however, was her descent into what resembles severe depression. Letters from her mother, Empress Maria Theresa, reveal deep concern for Antoinette's melancholy moods, sudden bursts of tears, and inability to sleep. In one correspondence, Maria Theresa admonishes her daughter for appearing weak and despondent, urging her to show more strength. This response, while typical of the 18th century, ignored the severity of Antoinette's condition. Today, historians and psychologists interpret these descriptions as clear signs of clinical depression. Her feelings of worthlessness, her loss of interest in courtly duties, and her frequent expressions of hopelessness reveal a mind weighed down by an illness that had no name in her time. But her mental struggles did not stop at depression. There is compelling evidence that Marie Antoinette may have developed symptoms consistent with post-traumatic stress disorder. The French Revolution exposed her to unimaginable psychological shocks. She was forced to watch as her friends, advisors, and loyal courtiers were executed. She endured the storming of Versailles, where rioters broke into her chambers and threatened her life. She was paraded before hostile crowds who spat on her and shouted insults. Each of these events was not merely political, it was deeply personal, embedding layers of trauma into her psyche. After the revolution began, witnesses described the queen as jumpy, sleepless, and plagued by sudden bouts of panic. She lived in a constant state of fear, which is one of the hallmarks of trauma-related mental illness. Her captivity only intensified these symptoms. In the Temple prison, deprived of her children and treated as a criminal, she began to waste away. Accounts from guards and fellow prisoners describe her as pale, withdrawn, and speaking only in whispers. She often stared for hours into space, seemingly detached from her surroundings. These are classic signs of both severe depression and dissociation, a mental state in which the mind detaches itself from unbearable reality. When her son was taken from her and indoctrinated against her, her mental collapse deepened further. The image of a queen once accused of arrogance now transformed into that of a broken woman, barely able to endure the weight of her suffering. Her final months reveal the tragic culmination of a lifetime of hidden mental illness. Facing execution, Marie Antoinette displayed what some have described as extraordinary composure. Yet this apparent strength may in fact have been a kind of numbness, the final psychological defense of a woman who had endured too much. On the day of her death, she apologized to her executioner for stepping on his foot, a detail often remembered as a sign of her dignity. But it also speaks to her dissociation. She was so detached from her own fate that she fixated on the smallest courtesies rather than the horror of her impending death. Marie Antoinette's hidden psychological suffering forces us to reconsider her story. She was not simply a queen who spent too much or a symbol of aristocratic decadence. She was a woman who endured relentless pressure, humiliation, and trauma, and who exhibited signs of mental illness that were invisible to her contemporaries. In many ways, her struggles mirror those faced by countless individuals throughout history whose conditions went unrecognized, unspoken, and untreated. The public perception of Marie Antoinette further complicated her hidden mental health struggles. Even as she endured profound psychological distress, the queen was constantly vilified by the press and pamphleteers. Anti-monarchist propaganda depicted her as morally corrupt, greedy, and callous, creating the infamous image of Madame Deficit. These slanders were often exaggerated or entirely fabricated, yet they had a profound psychological impact on a woman already suffering from depression and anxiety. Historians suggest that repeated exposure to hostile criticism can exacerbate symptoms of mental illness, sometimes even creating paranoia, which aligns with reports that Marie Antoinette became increasingly wary of those around her. She questioned the loyalty of her advisors, feared betrayal among her closest friends, and sometimes isolated herself entirely to avoid potential danger. In this hostile environment, her personal relationships became a source of both comfort and stress. Marie Antoinette's marriage to Louis, though initially arranged and distant, evolved into a partnership marked by affection but also mutual vulnerability. Louis himself was not emotionally robust. He struggled with indecision and poor health, and he was frequently manipulated by court factions. As a result, Marie Antoinette often carried a disproportionate burden of responsibility for the monarchy's stability. The pressure to maintain appearances, ensure political alliances, and bear children created a near-constant state of tension. For a mind already fragile from depression and trauma, these demands intensified every day. Her coping strategies often included immersion in courtly ritual and private indulgences, but they were not always sufficient. In times of extreme stress, Marie Antoinette reportedly experienced episodes of hysteria, a term used in the 18th century to describe a wide range of psychological disturbances in women, including fainting, uncontrollable crying, and emotional outbursts. Modern psychologists interpret these behaviors as manifestations of panic attacks or acute anxiety episodes. There are accounts of her suddenly weeping during council meetings, pacing her chambers for hours, or retreating entirely from social interactions. These behaviors, though frequently mocked by contemporaries, reflect the severe psychological strain she endured for decades. Rumors about her mental state spread widely, further damaging her reputation. Scandals such as the infamous diamond necklace affair, which falsely implicated her in a theft and scandalous behavior, fueled public outrage. Historians now argue that the stress from these incidents likely worsened her pre-existing mental conditions. She became trapped in a cycle. Anxiety and depression led to retreat and secrecy, which were misinterpreted as arrogance or indifference, which in turn led to more public scrutiny and emotional strain. It is a textbook example of how societal pressures and misinformation can compound personal psychological suffering. As the revolution gained momentum, her mental resilience was tested as never before. The Queen witnessed the violent dismantling of the monarchy she had tried to sustain. Friends were executed, political allies abandoned her, and the familiar Order of Versailles collapsed into chaos. Her diary entries from this period, though sparse, reveal a deepening sense of fear and foreboding. She described sleepless nights, constant worry about the safety of her children, and a sense of being pursued by invisible forces. Modern analysis suggests that these writings exhibit symptoms consistent with post-traumatic stress disorder, including hypervigilance, intrusive thoughts, and emotional numbing. The combination of acute trauma and chronic stress undoubtedly intensified her mental health struggles. Even in captivity, her mental state continued to deteriorate. Held in the temple prison with her children, she faced isolation, humiliation, and the constant fear of execution. Reports from those who observed her note that she often appeared disoriented, melancholic, and deeply withdrawn. Some historians believe she may have suffered from a form of psychosis during her final months, as she sometimes spoke to herself, exhibited signs of delusional thinking, or appeared unable to process the full reality of her situation. While her composure during her final moments is often praised, it may have been the product of psychological detachment, a protective mechanism in the face of overwhelming trauma. The intersection of her mental illnesses and public vilification highlights a tragic irony. The very behaviors and symptoms that could have elicited compassion were instead interpreted as evidence of moral failure. Her paranoia was seen as cunning, her depression as indifference, her panic as weakness, and her attempts at retreat as selfishness. In reality, Marie Antoinette's psychological struggles were profoundly human responses to unbearable pressures. They offer a glimpse into the lived experience of mental illness in a historical context, when the understanding of psychology was virtually non-existent and support systems were absent. Modern historians and psychologists increasingly recognize that her story is not merely one of political failure or historical spectacle. It is also a story of hidden suffering, a reminder that historical figures, even those who appear larger than life, are not immune to mental illness. Marie Antoinette's life illustrates how trauma, isolation, and relentless public scrutiny can devastate the human mind. Her experiences anticipate many of the insights of contemporary mental health awareness: the importance of recognizing psychological distress, the dangers of social isolation, and the profound impact of public shaming. By examining her hidden mental illnesses, we gain a deeper understanding of Marie Antoinette as a person, not just as a symbol. She was a young woman who endured unimaginable pressures, navigated a labyrinth of social and political expectations, and struggled with psychological conditions that were invisible to those around her. The queen, who is often remembered for her excesses, was also a woman fighting battles no one else could see. A life marked by courage, resilience, and tragedy. Marie Antoinette's final days encapsulate the culmination of decades of hidden suffering. As the revolution reached its peak, she faced the inevitable march toward execution. Stripped of her children, her freedom, and her dignity, she confronted a fate that no one could have softened. Witnesses describe her composure on the way to the guillotine, yet this outward calm masks a profound psychological truth. After a lifetime of trauma, isolation, and relentless scrutiny, her mind had adapted through detachment. This detachment allowed her to navigate the unbearable reality of death without collapsing entirely, a phenomenon often observed in individuals suffering from extreme chronic stress or trauma. Her execution was not only a political act, but also a final intersection of her private mental anguish with the public spectacle. Even in her last moments, she demonstrated attention to social decorum, apologizing to her executioner for stepping on his foot. Many have interpreted this as an act of grace, yet modern psychologists might see it as a final manifestation of her dissociation. Her focus on trivial social conventions, rather than the terror of her imminent death, reflects a mind that had learned to shield itself from overwhelming emotional pain. It is a tragic but revealing insight into the internal life of a queen who suffered silently for decades. In the years following her death, Marie Antoinette became an emblem of aristocratic excess and moral failure, her story simplified into caricature and legend. The Madame Deficit image persisted, overshadowing the psychological reality of her life. Yet, contemporary historians have begun to re-evaluate these narratives, emphasizing the human suffering behind the myth. By examining letters, personal accounts, and contemporary observations, scholars now suggest that her behaviors, once mocked or misinterpreted, are consistent with a range of mental health conditions, including depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, and possibly psychosis. This re-evaluation not only deepens our understanding of her as a historical figure, but also illuminates the broader ways in which society misinterprets the psychological suffering of women in positions of power. The Queen's mental struggles also challenge traditional interpretations of historical accountability. For centuries, she was blamed for the financial crisis in France, the failure of the monarchy, and even the revolution itself. Modern analysis, however, suggests that much of this blame was a convenient projection of societal frustration. Her hidden psychological disorders made her an easy target. When a person struggles with mental illness in an environment that demands perfection, every imperfection is magnified. Her depression, anxiety, and paranoia became fodder for public ridicule, reinforcing the false narrative of her moral and political failure. In reality, her psychological conditions were both a response to and a consequence of the impossible expectations placed upon her. Her hidden suffering also sheds light on the human cost of political and social pressures. Marie Antoinette's life illustrates how isolation, constant surveillance, and relentless public scrutiny can devastate an individual's mental health. These pressures were compounded by the loss of personal agency. Throughout her life, decisions about her marriage, her appearance, her public conduct, and even the fate of her children were controlled by forces beyond her control. This lack of autonomy, combined with a society that demanded perfection at every moment, contributed to the deep psychological scars she carried until her final hours. Perhaps the most poignant aspect of her story is how her hidden illnesses reveal the limitations of empathy in historical narratives. Observers of her life often dismissed her melancholy, panic, and withdrawal as vanity, laziness, or moral weakness. Yet a modern lens allows us to recognize these behaviors as human responses to extraordinary circumstances. In this light, Marie Antoinette is not merely a cautionary tale about excess. She is a case study in the enduring struggle of the human mind under extreme stress. Her life and death remind us that mental illness can be invisible, misunderstood, and tragically punished by society. Today, her story continues to resonate because it offers lessons beyond historical curiosity. It demonstrates the importance of compassion, psychological awareness, and the recognition that even the most public lives are often accompanied by private struggles. By re-examining her life through the lens of mental health, historians and psychologists illuminate the pressures faced by individuals trapped in systems that demand conformity, obedience, and unrelenting strength. Marie Antoinette's tragedy is not merely political, it is profoundly human. In the end, the queen, who has long been remembered for her elegance, her scandals, and her downfall, must also be remembered for her hidden suffering. Her struggles with depression, anxiety, trauma, and possibly psychosis challenge us to reconsider simplistic historical narratives and acknowledge the depth of human experience that often lies beneath the surface. Marie Antoinette's life, viewed through the lens of mental health, is a story of resilience and fragility, of a young woman navigating a world that offered little support and even less understanding. Her legacy reminds us that history is not only written in grand events and public spectacles, but also in the quiet, unseen battles fought within the mind.